There's another school that perhaps has received as much attention as any in this set of categories that harks back to Schweitzer's emphasis on Jesus as a prophet, one who looked to the future and who looked for God to soon intervene and create a new world and a new world order. It hasn't always been attached to the notion that Jesus had a timetable for all of this, so that one can look back and say he was mistaken. But there are some, including two books that are brand new this past summer. One by Paula Fredrickson from the University of Boston, and one by Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, that have tried to revive even that dimension of Schweitzer's approach. Then there are writers who have focused on all of the allusions throughout Jesus' teaching to that body of Jewish literature known as wisdom literature. Books like Proverbs and Psalms and Ecclesiastes. Other intertestamental Jewish works that contained further proverbs and wise instruction, and that began to develop a notion found already in the Old Testament in Proverbs 8 and 9 of God Himself being personified as wisdom, so that wisdom isn't just an abstract virtue, but begins to be a lady who can call out to the young men of the streets, "Come and learn from me and find wisdom from God." That branch can be subdivided into two quite different approaches. There is a burgeoning feminist scholarship, including in the study of the historical Jesus. The matriarch of that movement is almost certainly Elizabeth Schüssler-Fiorenza, now in partial retirement for many years at the University of Notre Dame, where the emphasis was on the fact that in both Hebrew and in Greek, wisdom was personified as a woman, and exploring all of the possibilities of Jesus alluding to and drawing on this divine feminine tradition. A man like Ben Witherington, a professor at Asbury Seminary in Kentucky, who also wrote The Jesus Quest that I alluded to, isn't so much concerned with gender issues as simply to show Jewish precedents for how Jesus and subsequent Christians could use language that sounded like language of divinity when the Jews were so unrelentingly monotheist. There is only one God and you cannot create another God. And then perhaps at the most conservative end of the spectrum are a number of scholars, not all of them evangelical Protestants by any means, who have focused on the question of Jesus seeing Himself as a Messiah, even if He was, we might call, a marginalized Messiah, one who was not ultimately viewed in those categories by many in His world. One of these scholars, and I think now is the time for me to both sit down and take off my coat, basically because it's hot up here. I guess you're making up for the cool day I came into. A specific focus on a man who I think has done the work that may be the most significant historical Jesus research of the past decade, if not in a considerable longer time than that. His friends call him Tom Wright. His books use NT. If you want to tackle a bite-sized bit of Wright, he has written a little book called Who Was Jesus? If you want to tackle a medium-sized book, he has written The Challenge of Jesus. And if you want to get your PhD in New Testament, you will need to read the 700 small print pages, Jesus and the Victory of God. Wright, like many in the Third Quest, takes the more holistic or integrative approach of asking a narrative question. In all the diversity of first-century Judaism, he observes there is one particular feature that any Galilean peasant fisherman waking up and going out to the lake for his morning's work would have daily been reminded of. The Jews, you see, believed that they were God's elect people. They believed that God had chosen to deal with them in certain unique ways that He had not chosen to deal with any other people He created. They believed their scriptures were the infallible, inerrant Word of God, and in those scriptures, Christians today call them the Old Testament, it was said over and over and over again that if the Jews would follow God and accept His covenant, they would live in the promised land. They would live in the land of Israel, and they would live in the land in freedom from any invading power, and in peace without warfare, and in prosperity, enjoying the fruit of the land. But you see, in the first half of the first century, Rome had been an occupying force since 63 B.C. No one living in the time of Christ, except perhaps the very oldest, by the time he began his public ministry, could ever have remembered a time when the Jews were a free people in the land the infallible God had promised to them in their inerrant scriptures. And so the question was, what went wrong? And what are we to do about it in order to claim those promises? Wright also wrote a book called The New Testament and the People of God, which goes into Jewish backgrounds in great detail and in a very fascinating way takes a look at all of the different Jewish groups and sects that we've ever uncovered and know about. And one can differentiate them in very helpful ways by asking and answering, as best we can, that specific question. The problem was the problem of exile, of not living in freedom. Many Jews were literally in exile, scattered around the Roman Empire, but even those that were living in their homeland were not living in freedom, free to enact and enforce their own laws and obey their God in all the ways they wanted to. What's gone wrong and what are we to do about it is an excellent way to get a handle on all the diversity of first century Judaism. Jesus, as a first century Jew, belongs in that spectrum of answers. And Wright's thesis boiled down the 700-page book or the 300-page book or the 150-page book to one sentence, which would never be fair, but we'll try anyway, is that Jesus came announcing that the exile was over without one Roman soldier having been removed from his post. Makes no sense. How can this be? Well, because in Jesus' teaching, according to Wright, and I think he's right, Jesus implicitly and explicitly made 5 significant redefinitions of very central Jewish tenets. He redefined monotheism. The Lord our God, the Lord is one, is straight out of the heart of the Jewish law, and Jesus quoted it and affirmed it. But yet he spoke about himself, and he spoke about the invisible Spirit of God in ways that would at least plant the seeds for what later was called the doctrine of the Trinity. That somehow God was involved with himself and with the Spirit that empowered him in a way that at the very least became problematic for many Jewish people.